pop that in the chat. I'm here at the Mount Pleasant Library today. My name's April, and I'm here with Eden Finday, the 2022 Indigenous Storyteller in Residence at the Vancouver Public Library. We are thrilled to see you. I see 19 people have joined the meeting already. And we're going to hold on for about a minute to let more people join us. If you'd like to say hello, please make a comment in the chat to say hi to me and Eden and to let us know what school you're from, what city you're from, what traditional territories you're joining us from. And oh, I see a hello, hi. So let's see, we're going to wait one more minute here. I see lots of classes joining us. We're thrilled to see you. I'm so happy to be here today. I am honored to be able to introduce Eden Finday, the Indigenous Storyteller in Residence at the Vancouver Public Library. Oh, I see someone joining from Renfrew Elementary, someone from Vernon, Ucluelet, more Vancouver. It's great to see folks joining us from all around the city and the province. Well, oh, and I see someone from New West, and they're letting us know their territory as well, the KK traditional territory, and Surrey on the Kwantlen and Katzie territory. Well, I think that I'm going to start talking a little bit more about what's going to happen today. So before we get started, I'm going to let you know that you can see me and you can see Eden, but we won't be able to see you or hear you. The chat is open though, so you are welcome to chime in if you've got something you want to note or to ask. My friend Kelly is in the background. You might see her name pop up in the chat now and then. She's going to be helping with any questions that might come up, might be able to help you if you have a few simple tech issues. And she'll probably be popping a few links up as well if there's anything that comes up that you might want to follow up on. We are going to be recording this. So if you've got classes at your school that weren't able to attend, they will be able to watch it later. It'll be up on the VPL YouTube channel. And thank you to those of you who sent in questions ahead of time. We'll see if we've got time to get to some of those questions at the end. And before I pass it on to Eden, I'd like to acknowledge that myself and the other Vancouver Public Library presenters are gathered on the unceded homelands of the Musqueam, Squamish, and Tsleil-Waututh nations. If you are joining us from other locations, take a moment to acknowledge the traditional territories on which you find yourself. We also invite you to post that in the chat if you haven't already. Now, as I said, we are really thrilled to have Eden Finday here to speak with us, the 2022 Indigenous Storyteller in Residence at the Vancouver Public Library. She comes to us with an impressive and varied set of skills. Eden is an author, a musician, a visual artist, and a proud Nehio Isqueo, a Cree woman. Eden is driven by her optimism for educating kids about Indigenous realities in a kind and empowering way. She has written about Indigenous issues for the CBC Kids website, and Dreamwalker is for her forthcoming novella about a 12-year-old girl dealing with the legacy of residential school trauma. I'd like to welcome Eden Finday.
Hello, thank you so much for having me here. Eden Finday Nitsikason, Sweetgrass First Nation, Ochinia. That means my name is Eden Finday, and I was born on the Sweetgrass First Nation. That's in Treaty 6 territory. I don't know if you've heard of the treaties, but when the Europeans first came to Canada 200 or 300 years ago, they started negotiating treaties with the First Peoples. A treaty is like a written agreement. Now, up until the Europeans had come, all of our agreements were oral. So we spoke, and we always spoke the truth. And when we made agreements, we made agreements through talking and ceremony, always ceremony. So when we signed the treaties with the Europeans, we had a ceremony. And it was a very sacred ceremony called the pipe ceremony, because for us, every syllable we speak is sacred and has meaning in our language. And so the treaties were a very sacred process for us. For the Europeans, I'm not sure if they were. Um, they wrote stuff down on papers that maybe we didn't quite understand because we didn't read or write English at that time. But they told us what they would be honoring. They let us know. And so we took their word for it. And so now in Canada, everyone is a treaty person. So the land you're on has been negotiated. Well, actually not this land, this is unceded territories. So where I'm right now is the unceded territories of the traditional homelands of the Squamish, Musqueam, and Tsleil-Waututh people. I'm sure you've heard people say that before. So unceded means that there actually was no treaty signed. They just took it. And so that's why sometimes you'll hear people say that this is stolen land. Where I'm from, in Treaty 6, there was a treaty process. So we signed a paper saying, we will use the land for this, you can use the land for that, basically welcoming the newcomers into our territories. And so in Canada in general, I like to say we're all treaty people. So even if you're not Indigenous, you are part of a country that made legal binding agreements with Indigenous people. So you're a treaty person as well. Everyone in Canada is. But I'd like to tell you a little bit about my life. So my grandmother was Irene Finday. She was born in 1922 and she got taken to St. Barnabas Residential School in Onion Lake in Saskatchewan for about 6 or 7 years. My grandfather was Alphonse Little Poplar. He was born in 1921 and he went to Delmas Residential School. That school was run by Roman Catholics. My dad told me that he got scooped when he was maybe 6 or 7 and he got taken to the schools and he got out in 1939 when he was 16. And my mom or my grandmother would have had a similar story. After 6 or 7 years, she was let out. And that would have been in the 1930s. The conditions in the residential school were not good. I suspect many of you already know that because you're starting to be taught that by your teachers and your families. A lot of children died in those schools from malnutrition. So they just weren't fed enough food. And there's a story about my grandfather, Alphonse. It was his job to go check the chicken house because eggs were going missing. And so the priest at the school told him, you have to go to the chicken house and watch out and try to catch the thief to see who's stealing those eggs. But it turned out the thief was my grandfather. He was the one stealing the eggs, and that's how he survived, by stealing food. So it was good that he was chosen to be the lookout because then he could keep on stealing those eggs. In 1929, that school that my grandfather went to, it burned down. It was burned down by a couple of people from my reserve, Sweetgrass, and the neighboring reserve, Poundmaker. They got together and they made a plan to burn it down. And they told the kids, they warned the kids that they were going to burn the school down that night. And they said, don't get changed into your pajamas, stay dressed. And at that time, I guess, in the kids' dormitory, there would have been many, many bunk beds, many, many beds in a long room. And at night, the nuns would lock the door. So those kids were locked inside that room all night. But on this particular night, when the fire was planned, one of the older boys went down and unlocked the door so that those kids could escape. And they burned that school down. And outside, my dad said, the story goes that there were 2 groups of people watching the school burn down. There was the little kids and they were just cheering while it burned down. And then there were the nuns in another group and they were crying. And I tell you this story because to me, it's amazing that we did that. It makes me proud. And I've actually put that scene into my novella. I wrote that into my book because I love the idea that my ancestors and my relatives tried so hard to protect their children from those institutions. And my dad always tells me, Indigenous people, we have been resistant this whole time, but we had to resist in a passive way. we couldn't do it actively because that was too dangerous. So if you actively resisted, you'd often get punished physically, and that could be deadly. So this was one of the ways that my family and my ancestors resisted residential schools. But of course, the school got rebuilt. I know that's happened too in other parts of the country. I've heard those stories. My father tells me that in the very beginning of time, there was a great explosion in the heavens. And out of that, everything in creation was born. And the first things to be born were the winds. So there are winds here on Earth. There are winds on the moon. There are winds on Saturn. They are our oldest spirits. We consider winds to be a spirit. And he told me that story, and he said, one of our oldest spirits is called the North Wind. And when he's having ceremony, he can connect with that spirit, and he can talk to that spirit, and that spirit can talk to him and teaches him about the very beginning of time for all of creation. I tell you this because it's part of my worldview that everything is a spirit. Everything has a spirit. And many people, even Cree people now, no longer know our oldest stories. Even many elders, if you ask them, my dad says they don't know them, and it concerns him because he wants those stories to be remembered. And he asked me to tell you, all of you, that story, so that you know that there's more to creation than just what you can see and touch, or just what you can watch on YouTube or read on Twitter. When I was 14, I began studying with my dad about plant medicine. In my culture, we call plants medicine. So sometimes you'll hear an Indigenous person say that they're going to pick medicine, and that just means we're going to pick plants. And when he started teaching me about that, I learned about respect for the earth and reciprocity. So reciprocity means there's a give and take. It's an equal relationship. So we give to the earth and she gives to us. So my dad took me to pick some sweetgrass, which is fitting because we were on Sweetgrass Reserve. Sweetgrass is a beautiful plant that you can dry it and then you can braid it. I don't know if you've ever seen a braid of sweetgrass, but I can show you one here in a minute. But before we pick the sweetgrass, there's always one thing we do. You must first ask the plant if you can pick it. You're asking the spirit of the plant, and that's how you show respect. And then you give an offering. And for us, we offer tobacco. That's part of a tradition. So I brought some here so I could show you how I do it. This is my huge container of tobacco. And if I ever wanted to pick a plant medicine that I wanted to use, say for smudging or any other purpose, I take some tobacco out and I put it down on the ground. My dad calls that laying down tobacco. And I put that down on the ground in thanks and gratitude for that plant's life, and to offer the tobacco to the spirit of that plant. And then we can pick. And my dad taught me, you never pick all of the plants in one area. So if you see a bunch of sweetgrass plants growing, you don't pick them all. That would be very disrespectful. You take what you need, and you always leave some behind so that that plant can regenerate itself and keep growing. And that's how you continue that plant exists forever. And so with the plants, we use them for a lot of things. We can create medicines from them. In fact, the Cree word for medicine, which I cannot pronounce, actually means, the Cree word for tea, I was going to say, actually means medicine water, because, when you have a plant, you can boil it in water and it'll have certain medicinal purposes, or sometimes you're preparing the root or the leaves and you do it in different ways. And that's how you make medicine. And so tea, we would just call it medicine water because it was like leaves, tea leaves and plants in water. But also something we do with our medicine is we smudge. I wonder if you've ever heard of smudging. Some of you surely have also done smudging, and some of you have heard of it, I'm sure, but I'll show you how I do it. I learned from my dad how to prepare the plant. He actually grinds it up into a fine powder because then it burns better. And you can see I have a little jar here that I created of powder, three different medicines that I put together. One of them is sage, one of them is sweetgrass, and then there's a willow fungus that we burn. It's very good for your lungs. It grows on willow trees, certain types of willow trees. And it smells so sweet. It's a beautiful smudge. So I'm going to show you what I'm going to do here, because I have a little very hot charcoal in my smudge pot, and watch what happens when I put the powder on. It begins to release some smoke. And this is what we use to pray. And this is what we use to cleanse ourselves too. So every day I smudge myself. And I put my hands over like this to gather all the smoke, and then I put it over my head and I ask for blessings. And I ask the spirit of these plants to help me, and I'll put it over my body part like my head, help me think straight, help me perceive clearly. Thank you for my eyes that I can see. Thank you for my ears that I can hear. Help me speak the truth and say good things with my mouth. And I'm a singer, so I like to take the smoke also and put it over my throat and say thank you for my voice, and I hope that I can keep singing. Yeah, and then often I'll even do my whole body. I'll do my arms. May I do good in the world today. My heart, may I be a good person. May I love. And then my legs, thank you for carrying me around all my life. Very grateful for my body. I'll put this over here where my window is open so I don't smoke myself out. I wanted to share that with you and explain to you that in my culture, everything is connected and everything has a spirit, and we are in relationship with all of those spirits. They're all around us. And when we start acknowledging the spirits that are all around us, they start acknowledging us too. I recently started praying to the eagle spirit because I was told to by my dad, and I always do what he tells me to do. And I would lay down tobacco and say a prayer to the eagle spirit. And since I've started doing that twice now, a bald eagle has flown right in front of my window at eye level, shocking me, like just so beautiful. Because in my culture, eagles are sacred. They are like one of the spirits we pray to. And so to see one so close and to feel like it was acknowledging my prayers was such a powerful and beautiful moment for me. And I've even taken a fish, bought one at a fish store, and brought it out to the woods, laid it down on the forest floor with some tobacco, and made an offering to that eagle spirit. Because I was told to do that, and I was told the eagle spirit likes salmon. So that's how I live my life now. I live my life knowing that I'm not alone ever, that I am connected to all the spirits around me, and even all my ancestors that are in the spirit world. I believe I'm connected to them. And the more I pay attention to my spiritual life, the less lonely I feel, the more connected I feel, the stronger I feel, and the better I'm able to live my life. So for me, knowing plant medicines, knowing my culture, knowing who I am has been a huge blessing. And unfortunately, it's a blessing that not all Native kids have anymore. That was our birthright, but since colonization, a lot of that has been taken away from us. In some families, after the residential schools, they never really recovered. They never reconnected with their culture. They may have survived physically, but their spiritual traditions were broken. They were disrupted. And that was actually the whole entire point of residential schools. I believe it was John A. Macdonald or one of his cronies who said, kill the Indian, save the man. So they wanted to kill our culture with those schools. And so they've done a very good job of that. But we're not all our culture is not lost. It's just for many kids, they don't have access to it. So that's part of why I'm here too, because I know there's Indigenous kids out there watching me, and I want you to know I see you. I know who you are. You have spirits. You have spirit helpers, and you're beautiful, and your culture is beautiful. And if you don't have access to that right now, that's okay. I didn't have access as a little kid either. And just know that you're not alone and that you belong somewhere in the great hoop of life. You're very, very important. And I would say that to all children. Creator doesn't make mistakes. You were meant to be here. We were all meant to be here together in this room. And we're creating something beautiful here, because even though there has been ugliness done in the past, we're finally starting to heal from that. And the fact that I can even be here talking with you today about this is proof of that healing. And I'm so, so grateful to be here. And I'm so glad that you guys are learning about this at your age. You're the first generation of Canadian kids who is learning about residential school. Your parents didn't learn about it. Your teachers didn't learn about it in school. They had to learn about it 5 years ago when everyone else figured it out. So you're the first, or 10 years ago, maybe, when the Truth and Reconciliation Commission was launched. But you're the first generation of kids who's being taught this as children in Canada. And I think that's very, very powerful. I know you will grow up to be better people than the founders of Canada were able to be, because you will know more. You will be more, you will have more understanding. So with the smudge, we pray to the spirits, and there are many. Plant medicine is one way we do that. So in the old days, you know, all Cree people had spirit helpers. And I can't speak for other nations. I don't want to talk for them because I don't know their cultures. I will only talk for my people, and we are Cree. We all had spirit helpers, and there were entire camps with hundreds of people in them where most people had that spiritual connection to their helpers, and to they could have ceremony and talk to the spirits and hear the spirits. It wasn't a special thing that only medicine men could do. It was our natural birthright. And I believe that all of you watching me right now, that is also your birthright, just as a human being. It's not exclusive to Indigenous people. Obviously, everyone all around the world, you have your cultures and you have your way of praying. And that's beautiful. And that's everyone's birthright, to have your connection to your own spirituality. So in the past, most Native people had that. It was just there. And so I believe that we're on our path to healing, and we're eventually going to get back to where we all feel connected, and we do feel connected to our spirit helpers. We believe that everything has a spirit. So every single plant has its own spirit. So there would be a sage spirit, and a sweetgrass spirit, and a cedar spirit, and a willow spirit. Every flower, everything has a different spirit that you could pray to. And each of those spirits have special powers or abilities or knowledge that they can share with you if you develop a relationship with them. And the same goes for animals, the bird people and the ones that crawl, and even the insects. Everything has a spirit, and they all have lessons to teach us. That's why you'll hear in so many creation stories how animals play such a big role. The Anishinabe creation story about the sky woman falling, and she gets caught by a flock of geese. Or there's a turtle island, I think it might also be Ojibwe or Anishinaabe, where they believe that they were on a turtle's back, and they kept sending different animals down to dig for mud, and none of the animals could do it except for muskrat. And muskrat managed to scoop up some mud in his paw, and he lost his life in the process, but he managed to come back up with that mud, and they put that on the turtle's back, and that's what created what they call Turtle Island, or as we would call it, North America. So many creation stories on these territories, on these lands, involve animals, because they are our brethren. We are not superior to them. We live in relationship with them, and we honor them. And even animals that don't exist, like Sasquatch, for us, he's a spirit. We've got a name for him in our language. We know where he lives. We know how to pray to him. It's not a funny story that we, search YouTube videos for us. He's a very real spirit, and he's in a spirit form, which is why most people can't see him most of the time. And I suspect, I'm not I'm not from, Western Europe or anything, but I suspect things like unicorns and leprechauns, I'm sure those are, and fairies, those are probably just the spirit helpers of those people's cultures. They probably are real on a spiritual dimension, but we talk about them as mythical, right? I think that that kind of knowledge is your birthright too, to be in touch with all of those mythical creatures and in the spirit world. So I don't speak Cree. Our language is called Nehiawewin, and Cree people, we will call ourselves Nehiaw. But I wasn't taught Cree because, I mean, I guess you could imagine why I don't speak Cree. In order to be fluent in a language, you have to hear it spoken. So even though it was my grandparents' first language and the one they spoke the most frequently, even though it was my dad's first language and he still is fluent in it, I don't speak it. And although I'm in a Cree class right now with a wonderful elder who's trying to teach us, there's only a few words that I understand. I was never immersed in it the way that I was immersed in English. Like everyone around me is always speaking English. I also speak French, so occasionally I've been immersed in French speaking culture. But yeah, for the Cree language, I've only heard it on visits to the res. And I never grew up on the res. I only visited every year, every couple years. So I'd hear my family speaking it, but it wasn't enough to actually learn it. And now I think about how our language is endangered and not many people speak it anymore. And yet the Cree language is the most spoken Indigenous language in Canada. It's the most popular one. It's the most likely to survive. And there's still so few of us who speak it, especially younger folks. Not that I'm young, I know that. But my dad's 75, and I feel like most fluent Cree speakers are more closer to his age than to my age. And our language is incredible. What I've learned about our language, it's very, very descriptive. So I find like in English, there's like a label for everything. Like that's a book, that's a tree, that's a desk. And like you stop, when you give something a label like that, you no longer are curious about it. You're like, I know what that thing is. It's a tree. I can continue. You don't have any more questions. But our language is so descriptive, and we generally didn't have labels like that. So if it was a tree, we might say, oh, that's the tree whose bark you can boil and use to treat stomach illness. We would have, and it would be a very long Cree word because we're describing how we use the tree. Or like I said, with like, we didn't call it tea, we called it medicine water. And when coffee came into our consciousness, lots of Native people love coffee now, but in our language, the word for coffee means burnt liquid because it's just black water, right? And so learning about my language has been so just such a wonderful experience for me, because when you learn a language, you learn a completely different way of looking at the world. So I studied French in high school, and then I ended up living in France for a year when I was much younger. And I was pretty much fluent for a while in my early 20s. And when you learn a new language, you have to describe everything differently. Like, in English, you say, I am hungry. In French, you say, I have hunger, and just hearing things like that helps your brain look at the world differently, right? From different perspectives. And Cree is the same. Every time I learn about Cree, I'm like, wow, what an amazing way to see the world. It's a very different point of view. And so one of my greatest hopes for myself is to become fluent in Cree. There's a university in Alberta that has a whole bachelor program. You can get your degree, your 4-year degree in the Cree language. I want to go there. I can't go there right now. I got my kids here, and I'm just kind of stuck here on these territories right now for the next 5 or 10 years till my kids are older. But maybe in the future I'll go to that university and I'll get a degree, because I love learning languages and I would like to get fluent in Cree. And then maybe someday I'll be the old lady who is fluent, and my kids and grandparents can come spend time with me and hear me speak the language, and I can give them teachings about the language. That would be a dream for me. I'm going to tell you a little bit about my family. So my grandparents had 11 children. which is quite common back then, and it still is sometimes in lots of First Nations communities. People have a lot of kids. So my dad was one of 11 children, and the other 10 were my aunties and uncles. But of my aunties and uncles, all of 10 of them, 4 of them died before I was born. So 2 of my uncles died in a car crash in 1975. Actually, so I would have been born. I was born in 74, but I was a baby, so I don't remember meeting them. And then in 1977, my Auntie Patsy and another one of her brothers died in another car accident. And I don't know if you know anything about reserves in Canada, but they are often in very remote areas that are difficult to get to. And so my reserve is about 30 minutes away from the closest town, and it's 30 minutes by highway driving, and it's a 2-lane highway, so just 1 lane in each direction. It can be pretty dangerous to drive on that highway in the winter, at night, and there's, deep, deep ditches you can accidentally drive into. And yet most Native people have been placed on these very remote reservations all over Canada and all over the States as well, actually. And they're often in very remote areas where they don't have access to cities or towns without driving. And so you'll find that in a lot of Indigenous communities and families that there has been a lot of loss through car accidents. And so nowadays, most Native people live in cities. I think it's something like 75% of Native people now live in cities or towns. And that's why, because here we can access healthcare and groceries and doctors if we need it. There's everything. The reason you live in cities, your families live in cities, because they're so convenient. There's food and shelter and all the other things you need to survive here. So, but a lot of our folks still live on reserves, and they're in very remote communities. And I wasn't sure if you ever were told about that. And I think it was done on purpose as part of the settlement process that the Europeans did, is they sort of wanted us Indians out of the way so that they could build their railroad and start digging up the earth and selling everything and oil and cutting down all the trees. They wanted us out of the way so they could get to what they call the natural resources of Canada, but what I would call is your birthright and part of the earth's beautiful bounty that we are here to respect and possibly protect. I was raised in East Vancouver. So yeah, just on Commercial Drive, basically Commercial and 3rd. Spent most of my childhood there. And so I didn't even actually meet my dad until I was, well, I mean, I met him as a baby, but I didn't meet him again until I was 14. And that's when we started this relationship where he was able to teach me what he knows. And, he went to residential school too. He went to Delmas residential. Oh, sorry, it was in Delmas, but it was called Gordon's. And just last week, there was an announcement in that community where the Gordon's school is that they found 14 unmarked graves. So there's still more kids being found, and that was the school that my dad went to. And he's told me a lot of stories about that school, and none of them are good. Not a single one of them. They're so bad that I wouldn't even want to repeat them here to you, because I don't want to hurt your spirit. But suffice to say, it's a miracle that my dad survived. And he didn't survive intact. He was very damaged when he came out. And so that's why he wasn't able to be in my life when I was a small child. He was not well enough to be a parent. And some of you might know what that's like. Some of you might experience something similar. Hey, if one of your mom or your dad isn't able to take care of you, and so you're living with someone else, maybe an aunt or an uncle, or you're in foster care. It's a very common experience in my community. So many people left those residential schools and they were so just so injured emotionally and mentally and spiritually that they couldn't function, But my dad, I feel very, very lucky because he not only survived, but he actually started healing. And from a very young age, I think he was 28 maybe when he got on his spiritual path and started studying with an elder and learning a bunch of knowledge. And so because he is now a knowledge keeper, he's able to teach me, and I'm so grateful. So I didn't have him in my early childhood, but I had him from the time I was 14 up. And it's a gift, you know, every time I'm with him, I record him. I turn on my phone, or I'll bring a little handheld recorder, and I literally record every word he says, because everything he says is traditional knowledge. He's like a very, very rare and precious being. You know, what traditional knowledge keepers know is not available anywhere else. There are no books about it. It's not on Google. Siri doesn't know it. Your teachers don't know it. Your parents don't know it. It doesn't exist. It's not written down. It can literally only be transmitted orally while you're in the room with that person. Or sometimes he calls me and I also record that. But, you know, to have access to this ancient wisdom is a blessing for me. And that's why I'm here to share that with you. Because a lot of people don't have access to their families, even Indigenous people. A lot of them don't have access to their families. There are more Native kids in foster care today than there were in residential school for the whole time those schools were open. So kids are still being taken away from their parents, and it's been going on and on for generation after generation. It's something that we need to heal from. I wanted to mention the Indian Act really briefly. It might be a little too old for some of you. I'll keep it brief. It's a piece of legislation, which means it's a law that the government wrote, and it's called the Indian Act. Because I guess back in the day, they called us Indians because way, way, way back in the day, the first white people who came here thought they had landed in India. So it just, even though when they realized they weren't in India, they just kept calling us Indians. So for a long time, all the politicians in Canada called us Indians, like up to very, very, very recently. And in fact, because it's a law, the Indian Act, legally speaking, I am an Indian of Canada. I have a card that literally says like status Indian. So legally speaking, I'm still an Indian, but we don't use that word anymore. And like many other words that are hurtful to people of different races and cultures, you know, if they use that word, that's fine. That's their business and it's their culture. You're not allowed to use that word, you know? So I don't use any other pejorative words that might be used against other cultures. And I don't generally appreciate it if someone non-native were to call me an Indian or Indian. It would be offensive probably to my ears. But we still, amongst ourselves, we call ourselves Indians, and we actually are legally Indians because of this piece of legislation that calls Indians. So in the eyes of Canada, to get any of the rights of our treaties, you have to be legally an Indian. I just wanted to explain that to you so you could start to understand a little bit about the language and how and why that word used to exist. After Indians, I think they started calling us natives, and then it was Aboriginals. Now it's Indigenous or First Nations. And it really is just a matter of what we want to be called. I find the word Indigenous doesn't really, it's kind of meaningless. All it means is like not white. You know, I guess I could be considered an Indigenous woman, but mostly I am a Nehiao. I'm a Nehiao Isqueyu. I am a Cree woman. Indigenous is not a culture in and of itself. There's no Indigenous language, right? Just like you could meet people from France and Spain and Germany and England and say, well, you're all European. And they'd be like, yeah, well, but we all have our own culture. We have our own language. We all have our own foods, and we all hate each other. They would be offended, you know, if you were speaking to a German and you said, oh, you're French, right? They'd be like, no, how dare you? And so I think sometimes we use the term Indigenous, but it's such a broad term. There's more than 200 different cultures in Canada. You know, you should start to learn about them, learn about whose land you're on right now, what's the soil under your feet, who lived here thousands of years ago, you know, who are the people of the land under your feet. And think about that. And they weren't just indigenous people, they had their own name for themselves. They had a whole language, different ways of praying, different ways of living, completely different belief systems, which is why that land is even still under your feet. We protected it because we lived in harmony with the earth, so that when the Europeans came, it was pristine. It was like as pristine as the moment it had been created, because even though we had been living here for 40,000 years, we had been using trees and we had been using plants to sustain us, and we had been killing animals for food and for shelter and for clothing, but we never hunted anything to extinction, and we never cleared cut a single forest. It just wasn't our way. It's not our teachings. And so because of that, this place was such a beautiful bounty that when Europeans came, they just thought, wow, look at all these trees we can cut down, and let's just kill all those buffalo to get those Indians out the way. And so start digging in the earth and get all the fossil fuels and the minerals and the diamonds, stuff that we had not really concerned ourselves with, because we were happy on the earth with what she provided for us. We didn't feel the need to dig for more. So, the earth is very, she's out of balance right now. You've noticed that, I'm sure. The weather is strange. There's more wind, and there's more rain, and there's more drought, and there's more fires, and that's a symptom. The earth is out of balance. She's being disrespected by humanity. We've been hurting her with all of our activities. So she's just trying to find balance again. And sometimes it can be a little scary, maybe, to see how the seasons are changing, or like how unseasonably cold it's been in April, or how ridiculously hot it got last August. Like when I was growing up in Vancouver, we never hit 40 degrees. Like that was for other continents with deserts and stuff. And now it's like, oh, we got to 40 degrees last summer. Like, wow, things are changing. So just notice that. Just notice that, you're a part of the earth. And so when she's suffering, we all feel that. I just want to talk about a couple last things, and then I can answer any questions if you like. I want to mention the right to vote in Canada. You'll hear that women got the right to vote in 1918. You'll be taught that in school, but I want you to remember that's only white women. Indigenous women and Indigenous people in general did not get the right to vote to 1962. So I just want you to know that, because oftentimes, like when I was in high school, I was taught about the suffragette movement and how the women got the vote in 1918. No one ever said the word white women. We were just supposed to assume that women was the norm. And if I was an Indigenous woman, that's the exception. So we could say Indigenous woman, but for a white woman, you would just say woman. But I like to call it out how it is. White women got the right to vote in 1918. Indigenous women and Indigenous men did not get the right to vote until 1962. I just want to bring that to you, to your attention. Think about that, and just remember, like, a lot of your parents and grandparents and teachers weren't even aware of that. It wasn't considered important information a few decades ago, but in my family, of course it was. It really it affected us. Those laws were made against us. They also outlawed our ceremonies, our spiritual ceremonies. So we had a sacred ceremony called the potlatch, where we would literally give away everything we owned. And that was to show like how rich you were, was to give away everything you owned. It's like the opposite of today's culture, where to show how rich you are, you try to own everything. Yeah, so that's how they tried to, along with residential schools, eliminate our culture. But they didn't. We're still here. I know there was a question too about storytelling and how I got into storytelling. And, I feel like I've always been a storyteller. I think that everybody is a storyteller. Like, if you like to talk and you want to tell someone about what happened to you the other day, or if you want to go see a Marvel movie or watch a show, like everyone who makes movies is a storyteller. Everyone who makes TV shows is a storyteller. Every kid who's talking to another kid about, you know, an idea in their head or drawing a comic or sharing something that happened to them the day before, you're a storyteller. I think that's how we connect with each other, is through story. I've just always felt that urge to express myself. I've been writing since I was a little kid. And then, you know, when I was about 19, I started writing songs, and that became my main focus. So I wrote music for about 30 years, and I still do that. But now I write, you know, more traditional, like stories on paper, writing them down. And I guess I just like to communicate. I like to communicate my thoughts and my feelings and who I am. So that's why I write stories. And I really believe that that you're a storyteller too, and your story is worth telling. And so if you ever feel lonely, you can write down your own story to yourself. Write about yourself and how you're feeling, and pay some attention to yourself, because that can really help with loneliness. Or if you don't feel understood, you know, write down your thoughts and your feelings, and then read it and try to understand yourself. Anyway, that's all I have. It's been so lovely to chat with you, but if anyone wants to ask questions or yeah, if you wanted to prompt me with anything, I'm happy to try to answer some now.
Had to find my own unmute. Thank you so much, Eden. You covered so much. That was that had me tearing up now and then, and feeling very inspired for the future at other moments. Thank you for sharing all of this with the kids who are out there. I love how positive and optimistic you are about what this generation can grow with. We had a couple questions that came in from the emails initially, and one of the classes had asked how you became a storyteller.
Yeah, so my dad was a storyteller. Actually, when I called my dad and said, oh, I'm applying to be the Indigenous storyteller in residence at the Vancouver Public Library, he said, oh, I started the very first Indigenous storyteller in residence program in Regina in 1996. I said, oh, that's hilarious and fitting.
Wow.
My grandfather too was a story keeper. He would archive, like he would interview all the elders in his day and record those conversations. He still got those. My dad still has those cassettes and videotapes from back in the day, but it's like our family was given the role of keeping stories. It's just something that we've all done, I guess.
Very cool. That answers the how did you get started as well. Someone asked if you had to take extra courses to be a storyteller. I think we know the answer to that, but if you'd like to know.
Well, you know, school can be helpful. I did go to university. I got my degree in language studies. That's where I learned really how to speak French. But school isn't necessary to become a storyteller, really. Life is. You just have to live, and as you live, you experience things, and then you can tell stories about those things that you've experienced, or you receive teachings, and then you can pass along those teachings in your stories.
I love that. Continuing on from storytelling. Oh, I see we have someone asking something related right in the chat, who's saying, what are the names of your books?
I don't have any books out yet, but there is one that's supposed to be coming out this year. It's going to be called Dreamwalker. And it's put out by McKellar and Martin, and they have a series that they're doing called The Journey Forward, and it's all about reconciliation. So their first book was last year, or a couple years ago actually, and it had they called it a flip book, where there's two like short fiction stories, one on each side by a different author.
I love those.
Yeah, so Richard Van Camp and Monique Kelly Gray were the first two authors. I know some schools have been reading them, and so I'll be one of the authors on the upcoming one that's coming out again this year. So it's called Dreamwalker. I don't really have any other books published. I mostly have been making music. but I am working on a children's graphic novel that I'm hoping to be writing this fall. And then I would love to have that published. So we'll see if that ends up happening.
Well, I'd love to see it. Oh, and another question that we'd had emailed in was, how many versions of your book did you go through before you got to the final copy?
Yeah, editing is a very humbling experience. I even have to edit, with my songs. The first time I write something, I think, oh my gosh, this is the best thing that's ever been written. And then, after 20 or 30 readings, it's like, oh, this needs a lot of work. So, I mean, I guess that's just how life is too, though, right? We're always editing. So we learn something, we do better. It could be everything from the way you play, a musical instrument, or the way you play a sport, or, you're constantly editing yourself and getting stronger, getting better. So I don't know how many versions I actually am still editing it, or I was going to just do one last final sort of read through. But generally, I would say maybe like 2 or 3 sort of major revisions. So major version changes.
Excellent. I love how you're talking about editing in all elements of life. I think that is great for all of us to hear, that people are not perfect the first go around. You need to work on these things.
Mm-hmm.
Oh, and I see you answered a question in the chat too while you were talking. Someone had asked where Eden lives now, and the answer is
Burnaby, BC. Although I'm moving back to New Westminster next week. I spent 15 years in New Westminster, and we just came out here to South Burnaby because there was this beautiful big house for rent, and we wanted to live on a beautiful big lot, and it's been lovely. But now we're going back to New West, and where my kids still go to school, easier for them to walk to school. We won't have to drive them every day.
That is super helpful. I don't see any more new questions coming in the chat, but we had a couple more things that we were thinking about here. You noted that you didn't grow up knowing your language. What does it mean to you learning part of it now?
It's every word I learn is a gift. Every word I learn to me feels like a teaching. It like contains the culture within the language. So learning the languages for me is learning my culture, and it's beautiful, but I'm also very frustrated. Like, I'm a language person. I like to collect languages. I like to speak languages. I've always always wanted to be multilingual. So to not speak Cree, I actually find quite frustrating. And how slow my progress is, and how few classes are available to me. I'm hoping to enroll at Regina. I think has like an online class you can take just for casual studies for Cree, like the first and second Cree classes. I'm trying to register there because there's like, it's very, very hard to find Cree language classes. And I find that kind of disrespectful. I'm like, in a country that talks about official languages so much, I hear no concern for Indigenous languages. The government gave some funding in 2018, but when that ran out 3 years later, they didn't renew the funding. So all the programs that had popped up, had to close. And I know French speakers and English speakers feel that French and English is important, but both of those languages are spoken by like hundreds of millions of people the world over. There's like 15,000 people who speak Cree.
Right.
It's not a million people, so I don't understand why more people aren't concerned about teaching people Cree. French and English, no matter if no one in Canada spoke a single word of French or English ever again, those languages would thrive for millennia. But if we don't start speaking Cree, we will lose it. All of us will lose. And then all of Canada loses the teachings that are in that language.
Absolutely. One of the students from Hastings Elementary is asking, seeing as your dad went to residential school, did he have to relearn Cree, or did he never forget it?
He never forgot it. And I went to Hastings Elementary School, by the way.
Oh, wow.
I went there for 3 years. It was by far my best school I've ever been to. Grades 5, 6, and 7. A wonderful experience.
Amazing.
That was in the 80s. That's how old I am, kids.
And someone's follow-up from Hastings is so cool. And someone else is asking if you have plans to write down the stories that your dad has passed on to you, or if that is something that is done.
Yeah. I am actually, because I have a terrible memory. And it's interesting because many of the stories in my culture, we're supposed to memorize them literally word for word. In our communities, there would be one child of every, family or group of kids that was their job, was to develop their memory, to be the living memory for that family or that group of folks. And often there was one child who would be raised by the grandparents so they could hear all the stories and hear all the teachings, and it would be their job to memorize that. And then all their adult life, they would tell the story over and over and over. And kids would, of the next generation would start to memorize it. That whole system has been disrupted by residential school. And I myself, I have a terrible memory. Like I can't even watch season 2 of a show. I'll forget what happened in season 1. Like I feel like it's a form of amnesia. My doctors claim it's not true. I'm like, but I don't remember like huge chunks of my life. Maybe it's trauma brain. I have a terrible memory. So what I do is I record him, and then I have his recordings transcribed so that, and my goal is to memorize it, but I want it written down so that if I don't, at least it's not forgotten.
Amazing. Seeing if we've had any more questions. I'm not seeing any more new ones. I just wanted to note here, you had mentioned about playing music. I'm not sure if the folks in the audience know that you actually toured with a band, which I think is super awesome. I'm sure we've got a lot of musicians who are out there. Do you want to tell them how you learned to play guitar?
Actually, it's I went to Templeton in grade 8. And I think the first year or the year right before they were starting like a rock band program at Templeton. I only went for 1 year, but took music and I did guitar there. But honestly, no, I did not have to go to residential school. I did not. And you know what's funny is if I had been born maybe 2 years earlier, I might have been. That's how close cut off I was. But yeah, I started in high school, I guess, but I was too shy. I wouldn't do it around anyone else. And it wasn't until I was like 19 I started writing songs. But even then I would literally like shut myself in my room and just like very quietly like compose songs and sing them to myself, because I was way too shy to play them out loud, until I met other musician friends who were like, well, we play instruments, but we don't know how to write songs. Why don't you bring your songs to us and we'll all play them together? So that's how I started doing that and being in bands.
Amazing. I've been listening to some of your music all weekend, and I recommend that some of the folks in the audience do too. It's quite lovely.
Oh, thank you.
I think we are almost out of time. So let's see if someone has about another minute to put in a question. Oh, here we go. I see someone asking about sharing the recording. Yes, we will be sharing the recording. It'll be up on the VPL YouTube channel probably within a couple of days. I'm not quite sure about the timeline for that, but it will be up there fairly soon. And I think, did you want to say any final comments to the group, Eden? You've shared so much with us today, but just in case there's something you want to end on.
I'm just so grateful to be here. And thank you so much for spending this time with me. And I'm sorry I didn't get to see your faces, but I'm really just grateful for all of you. So thank you. Thank you for today.
Thank you again so much. Oh, one last question trying to sneak in is, what are your thoughts about living on reserve regarding language learning? That sounds like a big one. Don't know if we'd have time for that in a minute.
That's the way to go. Yeah, that's
Mhm.
the only way I'd be able to learn my language. There's an elementary school on my reserve, and they teach them Cree there, and they probably are surrounded by grandparents who speak Cree. So that is language immersion right there.
Amazing.
Yep. Mm-hmm.
All right. Well, thank you for all that you've shared with us today. And thank you to everybody in the audience for coming and sharing your questions and sharing your time and your thoughts and your energy for this day. We will be sticking around for just a couple more minutes. So if you wanted to click on any of the links in the chat, you can, so you can follow up on those later. As Kelly is noting in the chat, if you have comments from the program or any other, we'd love to hear them. You can send a reply to the registration email. Oh, and for those of you who are eagerly awaiting news of this year's summer reading club, we can tell you that the theme this year is All Together Now, and it will be launching in June. Stay tuned for more information on that. So keep an eye out for more virtual programs from the Vancouver Public Library, and we'll see you another day. Thanks, everyone.
Thank you all so much. Take care. Bye.
And thank you all. One more minute for you to click on links in the chat. All right. Goodbye, my friends. Take care.